The battlefield was a wasteland. Smoke and debris hung thick in the air, clinging to the jagged remnants of a city once filled with life. Distant explosions rattled the ground, and the sound of heavy boots pounding against shattered concrete filled the silence between combatants. This was the front line of the Galactic Empire's war, and there was no room for weakness. Amidst the chaos, Jake "Merciless" Anderson, a Navy SEAL from Earth, crouched behind a crumbling wall, his sharp blue eyes scanning the horizon. He had been thrown into this war by the Empire after his feats during skirmishes on other planets had caught their attention. But he wasn't here by choice. He was here because they believed the human race, in all its ruggedness, could turn the tide. Jake ran a hand through his short, dark hair, a quick gesture of readiness, his fingers brushing over the battle scars on his face. He wasn't concerned with the politics. He didn't care about the Empire or the Resistance. His mission was simple: survive, fight, and protect the ones who couldn't do it for themselves. Across the battlefield, the Galactic Empire's elite soldiers were massing their forces, their polished armor gleaming under the twin suns of the war-torn planet. Their leader, a towering figure in dark, mechanized armor, stepped forward. This was Vrax, the Empire's top soldier, genetically enhanced, ruthlessly efficient, and feared across the galaxy. His reputation was legendary, and no one had ever defeated him in single combat. Vrax surveyed the Resistance fighters with contempt before his eyes locked on Jake, standing out among the rest with his human build, wearing nothing more than the combat fatigues and gear of an Earth soldier. "You," Vrax's voice echoed, amplified through his helmet's comm system. His gaze was cold, measuring. "You think you're worthy of fighting alongside the Empire? You're nothing but an insect." Jake's lips twisted into a slight smirk. "I've killed insects that were tougher than you." The Galactic soldiers standing behind Vrax exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence shaken by the words of this lone human. Vrax's fist clenched at his side, and without warning, he threw down a gauntlet. Literally. "A challenge," he growled, his voice dripping with malice. "Prove yourself in single combat. If you survive, I will consider you an ally. Fail, and you will die." Jake's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The sounds of war seemed to fade into the background, and all that remained was the weight of the challenge. Jake's heart rate steadied, his mind clicking into combat mode. He wasn't afraid of Vrax. He had faced worse, fought through hell. But he knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a message to the Empire, to the galaxy, that humans were more than just pawns. In a single smooth motion, Jake stepped forward, his boots crunching against the charred ground. Without a word, he raised his hand, his open palm connecting sharply with Vrax's chest plate in a loud crack. The slap was deliberate, calculated. It wasn't just a challenge. It was a statement. Vrax recoiled, stunned for a fraction of a second, his towering frame staggering back as the force of the slap rippled through his enhanced body. The sound of the slap was like a thunderclap, a shockwave that ran through the battlefield. A silence fell over the scene as the Galactic soldiers froze, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Vrax's eyes blazed with fury, his lips curling into a snarl. His fingers twitched, itching for his weapon. For the first time in his life, Vrax felt something he had never known: doubt. Jake didn't wait for him to recover. "Your move, big guy," he said, his voice low and steady, his gaze unwavering. The challenge had been made. The war had just become personal. The air was thick with tension, the silence hanging heavy between Jake and Vrax. Around them, the battlefield raged on. But for a moment, it felt like time had stopped, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Jake's hand, still stinging from the slap, remained open in the air for a second longer, daring the massive Galactic soldier to make the first move. Vrax's breath came in heavy, mechanical bursts, his enhanced body processing the slap with unnatural speed. His eyes narrowed, the cold blue light of his cybernetic implants flickering like distant stars. He was no longer just angry. He was insulted, and that would make him dangerous. Jake didn't wait for him to recover. With a low growl, Vrax charged. The ground trembled beneath his boots as he closed the distance in a blur of motion, a creature of raw power and speed. Jake's muscles tensed, but his expression didn't change. He was ready. Vrax's fist, a massive wrecking ball of force, shot forward. The world seemed to slow as Jake dropped low, his body reacting with the precision of a finely tuned machine. He twisted to the side, narrowly evading the devastating punch that would have crushed any normal human. The wind from the blow whipped past his face, the sheer force rattling the air. Jake didn't waste a second. He slid forward, moving like water, his combat instincts taking over. His elbow connected with Vrax's midsection, a precise strike aimed at the gaps in the soldier's armor. The sound of the impact was a sickening thud, but Vrax barely flinched. Instead, he swung his other arm in a wide arc, aiming to take Jake's head off with the momentum of a freight train. This time, Jake wasn't fast enough. The blow landed hard, and Jake's body was flung backward. His vision blurred for a moment, the impact ringing in his skull like a bell. But he didn't lose focus. His feet hit the ground with a controlled roll, and before Vrax could land a follow-up strike, Jake was back on his feet. Vrax advanced again, more calculated this time, his movements sharper. He wasn't just relying on brute strength anymore. The giant soldier seemed to be studying Jake, adapting. Each strike came with more precision, less wasted motion, as if the challenge had ignited a new level of focus in him. Jake, however, was no stranger to pain. His chest burned from the blow, but his mind was still clear. He knew the key to surviving. This wasn't just about strength. It was about timing, anticipation, and using Vrax's own power against him. Jake had fought tougher opponents before, and he wasn't going down now. Vrax swung again, this time aiming for Jake's head with a spinning kick that could crush bones. But Jake was already moving. He ducked low, the kick whistling just inches above his helmet. With a smooth motion, he grabbed Vrax's leg and yanked it out from under him, sending the giant crashing to the ground with a thunderous bang. The ground shook, and for a split second, the entire battlefield seemed to pause. Vrax's cybernetic enhancements hissed and sparked as he struggled to rise, fury in his eyes. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of humiliation, especially not from a human. Jake stood over him, breathing heavily but steady. His hand was already reaching for his combat knife, its hilt familiar and comforting in his palm. He wasn't here to prove he could win. He was here to survive, and if he had to make this giant beg for mercy, he would. "You've underestimated me," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying across the field. "And that's your biggest mistake." Vrax's eyes burned with rage, but deep inside, there was a flicker of uncertainty. The human had just shown him something he wasn't sure he could beat. The air crackled with tension as Vrax rose from the ground, his enhanced muscles pushing him upward with mechanical precision. Sparks crackled from his cybernetic joints as he straightened, his expression twisted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. For the first time, he wasn't the predator. He was the prey. The realization shook him more than any blow Jake had landed. Jake stood at the ready, sweat trickling down his brow, his stance steady despite the heavy toll the fight had taken. His chest ached from the impacts, but he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Vrax's mechanical voice growled through the comms. "You should have stayed in your place, human." Jake didn't respond. His eyes never left Vrax. He was watching, calculating, waiting for the next move. There was a change in Vrax's movements now, subtle, but unmistakable. The arrogance had slipped away, replaced by something far more dangerous, uncertainty. With a hiss, Vrax raised his arms. Hidden beneath his armor were plasma cannons, miniature weapons designed to melt through anything in seconds. His fingers twitched, and Jake could almost feel the heat of the plasma charging up. This was it. Vrax was no longer holding back. Jake didn't hesitate. In the blink of an eye, he was already on the move. Vrax fired, a searing beam of energy cutting through the air with a deafening hum. Jake dove to the side, just narrowly avoiding the blast. The beam left a glowing scar across the ground where it had struck. The heat from it scorched the air, but Jake kept moving, rolling and darting behind the broken remnants of a nearby structure. Vrax stalked forward, each step shaking the earth beneath him. The Empire's soldier was now more than just a trained warrior. He was a machine, calculating every angle, analyzing his opponent's every move. But there was something Jake had that Vrax didn't: human unpredictability. Jake rose from behind the debris, eyes locked on Vrax. The tension in the air was thick. The surrounding soldiers on both sides were watching intently, their mouths silent, the violence of the moment stealing their voices. They didn't know what to expect next. Neither did Jake, but that was part of the beauty of it. Vrax opened fire again, his plasma cannons erupting with controlled fury. Jake zigzagged through the smoke and rubble, faster than any man had a right to be, moving on instinct, his training in urban combat coming to the forefront. The shots came closer, but never quite found their mark. And then, just as Vrax charged once more, Jake made his move. He rushed forward, slipping through the narrow space between a crumbling building and a half-destroyed tank. His hand shot out, grabbing hold of a piece of twisted metal, and with a grunt of effort, he hurled it straight at Vrax's head. Vrax recoiled just enough to be distracted, just long enough. In that split second, Jake was on him, his combat knife flashing in the dim light. With a swift, practiced motion, he plunged the blade into a weak spot on Vrax's armor. It was a calculated strike, aimed at the gap in Vrax's defenses, just under the shoulder. The feedback was immediate. Vrax's entire body shuddered as the knife bit deep, cutting into the wiring that powered his enhancements. Vrax froze, a harsh gasp of surprise breaking through his normally controlled demeanor. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind whipping through the ruins. Jake stood over him, panting, but his eyes were locked on the soldier's vulnerable state. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had done it. He had found the crack in the armor, the weakness beneath the unyielding surface. The impossible had happened. Jake knew that victory wasn't guaranteed yet. Vrax was far from finished, but the game had changed. In that moment, the realization settled in Vrax's mind with bitter clarity. He was no longer the apex predator. This human was something else entirely. The battlefield had become a cruel game of cat and mouse, but for the first time, the cat was the one on the defensive. Vrax, the towering galactic soldier, staggered back, his cybernetic limbs sparking and malfunctioning as Jake's knife still lodged in the gap of his armor. He grunted, but there was no arrogance in his voice now, only a raw, primal fury. Jake didn't give him a second to recover. He could feel the shift in the air. The weight of the fight was no longer on Vrax's side. For the first time, Vrax was fighting against someone who understood the unpredictable chaos of war, someone who didn't rely on enhanced power, but pure human grit. Vrax's breathing was labored now, and his once unshakable confidence faltered as he reached for the blade still embedded in his armor. But Jake wasn't about to let up. In one fluid motion, he sprinted forward, a blur of movement. Vrax had barely begun to react when Jake tackled him, throwing all of his weight into the collision. The sound of the two bodies crashing into the ground echoed across the ruins, a harsh reminder of the raw violence unfolding. Jake's knee pressed into Vrax's chest, pinning the larger soldier down. His hand shot out, grabbing the plasma pistol holstered at Vrax's side, ripping it free. Before Vrax could raise a fist, Jake slammed the weapon against his armored face, knocking the soldier's helmet askew. "Not so confident now, are you?" Jake said, his voice steady, filled with the quiet strength that only humans could possess. Vrax's eyes burned with rage, but there was something else in them too. Fear. Fear of something he couldn't predict, something he couldn't control. With a roar, Vrax shoved Jake off, using his raw strength to send him sprawling backward. The force of the move sent a shockwave through the ground, and the dust around them billowed up, momentarily blinding both of them. Jake rolled quickly to his feet, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He had underestimated how powerful Vrax was, but that moment of hesitation had given him the upper hand. Vrax, however, was recovering faster than Jake anticipated. With a loud snarl, the Galactic soldier's limbs twitched as he activated an array of new weapons hidden within his armor. From his back, Vrax unfurled a pair of energy blades, the blue light crackling as they extended into deadly arcs. He swung one of them in a wide arc, and Jake barely dodged in time, the blade slicing through the air just inches from his chest. The speed was incredible, the force enough to sever stone and steel, but Jake's instincts kicked in, and he was already moving. "Come on, big guy," Jake taunted, moving with fluid grace as he dodged another deadly swing. "Show me what you've really got." Vrax's eyes narrowed, a hiss coming through the comms as he locked onto Jake with renewed focus. The fight had shifted again, the stakes higher than ever. But this time, Jake wasn't just reacting. He was anticipating, staying one step ahead. Vrax charged, the energy blades flashing, but Jake was already making his move. With a quick twist, he grabbed a piece of debris, sharp, jagged metal, and used it as a shield, deflecting the next strike with a loud clang. The impact sent a shock through Jake's arms, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about proving that humanity had something no amount of cybernetic enhancement could replicate: the will to fight, to survive against all odds. Jake launched himself at Vrax again, using his momentum to slam the sharp metal directly into a weak spot in Vrax's chest armor. The soldier let out a strangled cry as the blade sank deep, the lights in his helmet flickering wildly as the feedback from his damaged systems surged through his body. Jake pulled back just in time to avoid another counterattack. Vrax stumbled, his towering form faltering. The battle had tilted once again, but this time, it was clear, Jake was in control. And Vrax, despite all his power, was finally beginning to understand that this human was a force to be reckoned with. Vrax's systems sputtered, his body jerking as sparks erupted from the damaged section of his chest armor. His breathing was ragged, each inhale like a sharp grind of gears, the once fluid movement of his enhanced limbs now slowed. His eyes, cold and calculating, flickered in disbelief, the realization settling in like a heavy weight. This human, this mere human, was pushing him to the brink. Jake stood just a few feet away, his chest heaving with exertion. Sweat dripped from his forehead, his muscles aching from the relentless combat, but his focus was sharper than ever. His knife, now covered in the remnants of Vrax's damaged armor, was held firmly in his hand, ready for whatever came next. The battlefield around them felt as though it had melted away. There was nothing but the two of them now, locked in this violent life-or-death struggle. Vrax took a step forward, his massive figure looming, and Jake's muscles tensed in response. But there was a shift in the air, a hesitation in the way Vrax moved. He wasn't sure anymore, and that uncertainty was something Jake would exploit. "You're not going to win this," Jake said, his voice steady, though the weight of his words carried a heavy truth. "Not today." Vrax's glare was a storm of fury, but even his enhanced mind couldn't ignore the truth. Jake wasn't the soldier who would bow down, the man who could be defeated by a single blow. The human was relentless. Vrax had underestimated him, and now it was too late to change the course of this fight. With a roar, Vrax lunged, the energy blades in his hands flashing in a blur. Jake barely dodged the first strike, feeling the air shift as the blade missed by inches. But Vrax's speed was still there, and the second blade followed in a vicious arc, slicing toward Jake's side. Jake twisted, his body moving with the rhythm of a dancer, narrowly avoiding the strike. He planted his feet and pushed forward with all his strength. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He couldn't afford to give Vrax a moment to recover. With one swift movement, Jake lunged in close, his combat knife flashing toward the exposed section of Vrax's neck. The blade bit deep into the gap, and the sound of metal screeching against cybernetic plating echoed in the air. Vrax let out a scream, a raw, mechanical roar that rattled the air, his body flailing, trying to throw Jake off. But Jake held firm, his grip tightening on the knife. His other hand shot forward, grabbing hold of a vulnerable joint in Vrax's armor, wrenching it with all his might. Sparks flew, and Vrax's mechanical limbs began to seize, the feedback from the damage sending tremors through his entire body. In a final desperate attempt, Vrax swung wildly, his energy blades cutting through the air. But it was too late. Jake was already on him, his knife plunging deeper, locking in a final decisive strike. The lights in Vrax's helmet flickered one last time, his body going still. The war machine, the Empire's greatest soldier, was defeated by a human, a single, determined human. Jake stood over him, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. Blood dripped from his hand, staining the blade he had used to bring down the giant. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, looking down at the fallen soldier, the weight of the battle settling over him. He didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. The war wasn't over, but in this moment, Jake had proven something far more important. The will to fight, to never give up, was humanity's greatest weapon. And Vrax, he had learned that lesson too late. The silence was deafening. The battlefield, once filled with the screams of battle, the thunderous sound of weapons clashing, now seemed eerily still. Jake stood over Vrax's crumpled form, the once feared Galactic soldier sprawled on the ground, his body twitching in the final moments of life. The soldier's mechanical systems were still sputtering, flickering in and out of functionality, but it was clear that the fight had drained all the life from him. Jake's chest heaved with each breath, his body battered and bruised, but his eyes never left Vrax. He had done it. He had taken down the Empire's greatest warrior, but even as his heart raced with the adrenaline of victory, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that this battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. Behind him, the remnants of the resistance, the ragtag group of soldiers who had joined him in this war, were watching in stunned silence. They had seen the unimaginable unfold before their eyes. The defeat of the invincible Vrax, the ruthless machine of war, by a single human. But there was no time for celebration. The air was thick with the knowledge that the Empire's forces were still closing in. Jake turned, his gaze hardening as he looked out across the battlefield. The Empire's reinforcements were already arriving, hundreds of soldiers in gleaming armor, their massive ships descending from the sky, casting shadows over the ruins below. Jake's heart sank. This was only the beginning. The faint hum of the incoming ships grew louder as they touched down, their landing gear screeching against the cracked earth. The resistance soldiers, still in shock from the victory over Vrax, snapped out of their stupor and began to scramble for position. But Jake knew it wouldn't be enough. There were too many of them. He reached for his sidearm, the weight of it familiar in his hand. But as he did, a voice called out from behind him, low, urgent. "Jake." It was Captain Myra, the leader of the resistance, her face streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes sharp and determined. "We need to fall back. Now." Jake's jaw clenched. He could feel the pull of urgency in her voice. He knew what she was asking. But he couldn't leave, not after everything they had fought for. Not after everything he had sacrificed to get this far. "We stand our ground," Jake said, his voice steady, though the decision weighed heavily on him. He turned to face the approaching enemy once more, his hand tightening around his weapon. "We fight. We make them understand what happens when they push humanity too far." Myra hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the advancing Empire forces. She could see the resolve in his eyes, the unyielding spirit that defined him. And she knew she couldn't change his mind. With a heavy sigh, she nodded. "Then we fight together," she said, drawing her own weapon and stepping up beside him. Jake's eyes briefly met hers, a silent understanding passing between them. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future, for their world, for every human who had ever been underestimated. The Empire's forces had arrived, but Jake wasn't afraid. He had faced down the impossible, and with the resistance behind him, he knew this fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. With one final glance at Vrax's lifeless body, Jake turned to face the incoming storm. The final stand had begun. The Empire's forces were advancing, their heavy footsteps echoing through the ruins, their weapons gleaming in the dying light of the battlefield. The sound of their march was methodical, relentless, and it struck fear into the hearts of those who saw them coming. But Jake stood tall, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The odds were stacked against them, he knew that, but the fire inside him burned hotter than ever. He wasn't about to let fear take hold. "Get ready," Captain Myra shouted, rallying the resistance troops behind him. Their faces were a mix of exhaustion and defiance, but the spark of determination still burned in their eyes. This was their home, their world, and they wouldn't let the Empire take it. Jake didn't need to hear any more. He was already moving, his boots crunching against the charred ground as he led the charge. The battle had already taken so much from him, but the thought of backing down was impossible. He was a soldier, trained to fight when all seemed lost. And this time, humanity would show the Empire what true resistance looked like. Behind him, the resistance opened fire. The first volley of gunfire rang out, followed by the staccato hum of energy weapons and the deafening roar of explosives. The sound of their shots reverberated in the open space, but Jake didn't flinch. His focus was razor-sharp as he sprinted toward the front lines of the Empire's reinforcements. The first wave of soldiers rushed toward him, their armor a sleek, deadly silhouette against the fiery orange sky. Jake was already moving, his hand gripping his plasma rifle tightly. He fired, the sharp crack of the weapon echoing, as the blast hit the first soldier in the chest. The enemy's armor flared bright orange with the impact, and the soldier was thrown back, collapsing to the ground. But there were more, too many more. Vrax's defeat had only made them angry, and the Empire's forces seemed to surge with renewed purpose. Jake gritted his teeth and ran faster, his heart pounding in his chest. Each step felt like it might be his last, but it didn't matter. Every step brought him closer to the battle, closer to a moment that could decide everything. Beside him, Myra moved with deadly precision, taking down one soldier after another, her eyes never leaving the target. They were a team, working seamlessly together, their trust in each other unspoken but absolute. Jake couldn't afford to lose focus, not when every move could be his last. The sound of jetpacks filled the air as the Empire's aerial units swooped down from above, their blasters crackling with deadly energy. Jake ducked as one of the blasts flew past his ear, but he didn't stop. Instead, he grabbed a grenade from his belt and tossed it toward the incoming threat. It exploded in midair, sending shrapnel raining down as two of the enemy units were engulfed in a fiery blast. "Keep moving." Myra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. Jake glanced over, nodding in acknowledgement. They were a unit now, not just individuals fighting for survival. They had become something more, something the Empire hadn't prepared for. They were human. With every step, Jake could feel the pressure of the fight bearing down on him, the weight of responsibility hanging heavy on his shoulders. But he kept pushing, his legs moving, his hands steady, his mind focused. They weren't just fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for the very soul of humanity. As the battle raged around him, Jake's resolve solidified. He could see the determination in the eyes of his comrades, hear the screams of defiance in the air. The tide was turning, and this time, the Empire would know that humanity wasn't just a blip in the galaxy. It was a force to be reckoned with. The sky above was painted with streaks of fire, the smoke from the burning battlefield swirling in the air like an ominous storm. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears, his breath ragged as he sprinted forward, the weight of his rifle steady in his hands. The fight had escalated to a fever pitch. The resistance was holding their ground, but just barely. The Empire's forces were everywhere now. Endless waves of soldiers, elite units, and heavy artillery. But Jake wasn't backing down. Not this time. He could see Myra ahead, her silhouette outlined against the glow of explosions, her eyes sharp, calculating. She was in motion, always in motion, weaving between cover, taking down enemies with precision. She turned for a moment, catching his eye. "We can't hold them forever," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "We need to take out their command center." Jake nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Then let's make it count." With that, they pushed forward, weaving through the wreckage of fallen soldiers, the shattered remains of vehicles, and the debris of what had once been a thriving city. Every step they took was a risk, but there was no turning back now. The Empire's forces were relentless, their soldiers pressing forward, their guns trained on every corner, every potential threat. But Jake had something they didn't, a will to fight that could not be broken. He could feel the fire burning inside him, the anger, the defiance. For all the damage they had done, the destruction they had left in their wake, they would not crush humanity's spirit. As they neared the heart of the Empire's forces, Jake's mind raced, calculating the best way to strike. The command center was guarded by a wall of heavily armored troops, soldiers whose weapons could cut through steel with ease. But Jake wasn't intimidated. He had seen worse. He had survived worse. "On my mark," Jake whispered to Myra, his voice steady as he pulled a grenade from his belt. The pin was pulled, and with a swift motion, he hurled it toward the entrance of the command center. The explosion was deafening, sending a shockwave through the ground that rattled the air and knocked several of the enemy soldiers off their feet. "Move," Jake shouted, charging forward, his rifle raised. The resistance stormed the entrance, their weapons firing in unison as they cut through the remaining guards. Jake was right there with them, moving with lethal precision, each shot finding its mark. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning metal, but Jake didn't flinch. This was the moment they had been fighting for. Inside the command center, the walls were lined with screens, flashing with data, with orders being relayed from Empire Command. At the center of it all was the Empire's leader, a towering figure surrounded by high-ranking officers. They were taken off guard, scrambling as Jake and Myra burst through the door. "You're finished," Jake said, his voice cold, unyielding. The leader sneered, but before he could issue a command, Myra's rifle cracked, the shot piercing through the chaos and hitting its target with deadly accuracy. The leader crumpled to the ground, his forces scattering in panic. Jake stepped forward, his eyes burning with the fire of victory. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and now they were about to learn just how wrong they were. For Jake, there was no turning back. This was the beginning of a new chapter for humanity, one they would write on their own terms.